thank you very much for having me. My name is Michael Sanger, and I work for the Global Alliances team at Hogan Assessment Systems. It's there that I support our Asia-Pacific partners and the international network sell and apply Hogan assessments, and also build services around them. And as you can imagine, that takes a lot of listening to these partners talk about the metrics and their interpretations, and how that relates to their local management culture. This is a learning opportunity that's also shared by many multinational corporations, or MNCs, as they look to deploy global HR initiatives. So I wanted to take this opportunity and talk to you a little bit about leadership expectations and how they vary across the world. But before I begin, I thought it might be helpful to speak for just a moment about my background in the area. I studied IO psychology for a few semesters in the Netherlands, and that was an amazing experience. And so immediately after grad school, I pursued life abroad again and moved out to Shanghai to advance a career in talent management. And the years that followed offered wonderful opportunities to interview and assess senior executives, to study local leadership norms, and even to publish research around personality and the differences therein, all with the backdrop of boomtown China. And it was there that I also saw firsthand the true imperative for really understanding international differences as they relate to or as they influence managerial approaches. Because halfway through my time there, the economic crisis hit the West, and foreign multinationals began to pull back the expats. Suddenly the Germans, the US, the Australians that were the managing executives across China were too expensive to maintain abroad, and so localization began to get accelerated. But unfortunately, this led to the indigenous benefactors of hastily enacted succession plans carrying twice the load with only half of the resources. And so it really was an interesting time to be there because all of a sudden the very survival of these organizations were in the hands of Chinese leaders who had certain leadership styles, and those leadership styles featured nuances that were poorly understood by headquarters. And China is only one part of a diverse continent that's consistently balanced out the customer bases and the operations of these organizations. After all, 2 out of the 3 top economies reside in Asia, Japan and China. And soon to be 4 out of the top 10 as Indonesia and India join the ranks, all of them with increasingly competitive talent pools. And beyond Asia, there's Africa, Latin America, Eastern Europe, are all becoming just as integral to these multinational enterprises. And as a result, companies have begun to recognize the need for culturally diverse business perspectives at the very senior levels. Not only are multinationals from the US and Europe promoting locally cultivated individuals to senior executive positions, by the way, were traditionally held by emissaries from headquarters, they're also beginning to nominate these corporate officers to their executive boards. A great example is Jorge Montoya, who started off as a brand assistant at Procter & Gamble Peru and worked his way all the way up to president of Global Snacks and Beverages. Upon his retirement, he was the 2nd highest ranking executive officer globally and is now 1 out of 3 internationally hailing executive board members at Gap International. Another good story is Dr. Daha Yu, who was a minor research and development role and worked his way all the way up to president of Ebonic Greater China before being asked to join their board of directors. But unfortunately, this is not as commonplace just yet, because what I've seen is that performance evaluations tend to inadvertently pass over top talents when those top talents are foreign to the culture of headquarters, simply by way of their design. For example, HR may steer development in the right direction, but have absolutely no information on where to emphasize things, which can lead to few easy wins or even encourage resistance. Take a typical multinational high potential model. A lot of the times it has a domain in there called drive. And a lot of the times that drive is defined as something like to pursue a goal with energy. And from our research at Hogan, what we have found is that certain management cultures will look at that as a product of agency or self-initiation, what we call ambition. Other management cultures look at that as a product of follow-through or conscientiousness, something we call prudence. And so what I see is that if we have valid work-relevant personality metrics underlying these models, we can understand where to adapt them, while preserving the same definition of drive and the results that transpire when you achieve it, but understanding that different management cultures may see different behaviors leading to these results. If you think about domains like communication effectiveness or team behaviors, you can start to see that variance a little easier. So from these experiences, I think it's safe to say that distinct cultures exist. And researchers from Hofstede to Javidan note that leadership expectations vary accordingly. Our own research at Hogan has shown varying incidences of personality characteristics across countries. But that begs the question, and before I continue, I think it's good to ask, what is culture? And if you ask me, it's an excuse. It really is, quite frankly. Because whether you're American or you're Russian or you're Brazilian, you could turn around and say, well, that's how we do things where I'm from. And so in the organizations, in the day-to-day, it becomes a screen by which people can hide behind. And I say it's an excuse, and I mean that emphatically, that it's an excuse because it's easy to assert, but it's difficult to define and difficult to measure. In fact, if I sat you down and talked to you about your own culture and gave you all the time in the world, I doubt that you could really put some hard-line parameters around it. Because what are we really talking about? Are we talking about nationality? Are we talking about ethnicity or race? Are we talking about religion? Are we talking about modern culture or traditional culture? Is it based on self-identification at all? Where do we draw the line and say what is Indian, what is Chinese, or what is South African? To me, what's more interesting and more relevant are the characteristics of those who climb the ranks in, say, Brazil, when the collective implicitly looks up and sees those with subordinates and with power and says, now that's a leader. And what I'm talking about here are local leadership benchmarks. And the best part about benchmarks, besides their relevance to the talent management world, because we're talking about leaders and not just flimsy definitions of culture, is that they debunk stereotypes. Because if we observe someone from another culture, we may see they don't necessarily look you in the eye, or they need to confer before making a decision, or they need to be, they may wait to speak, wait to be spoken to before speaking. But that doesn't necessarily mean from the data that they can't drive a team, that they can't drive results, or they can't sit on your board. And personality metrics begin to tease that out. The other nice thing about local leadership benchmarks is the parameters are much more easily defined. Because remember, we're talking about in the realm of organizations. And so here, shared modern economic and sociological histories have a lot more relevance and deserve a lot more attention. I'll give you an example. Take China, for example. Mid-last century, they experienced the Cultural Revolution. Cultural Revolution did away with an entire generation of managers as the educated were persecuted. And the years that followed forced the labor force to see relationships with coworkers on par with those with the family, so equal footings. Fast forward a generation, you've got a one-child policy, and with one egg in the basket, parents tend to stress or emphasize educational opportunities over early professional exposures. And so what that does, and therefore these students don't have as much opportunity to cut their teeth on early professional interactions. And what that does for mainland China, that leads to very different needs, very different customs, and very different tolerated behaviors in the workplace. And that directly influences how leaders are identified. And besides shared modern histories, in most cases, shared language is also key. From our research at Hogan, we have found that written language is the cultural lens through which people view assessment items. And in the China example I just used, think about Hong Kong, Macau, and Taiwan. Not only did they not share that modern and economic history, but they also don't share a common written language, with these territories reading traditional Chinese and the mainland reading simplified. So in understanding, say, a Chinese leader, we know to separate that out and look at the mainland on its own. Whereas if we looked at cultural confines, they might tell you this is all just one culture, and when in fact there's different leadership expectations in the organizations between mainland and those territories. Now, this is not to say that we need to be sensitive for all jobs. A pilot is still a pilot, and a pilot's job a majority of the time is monotonous, and a small sliver of time they really need to be on their game. And so I want to make sure, no matter what pilot it is, that he or she is able to tolerate redundancy and stay cool and calm under pressure. I don't care if you're flying Qatar or Qantas or Kenyan Airways. But as mentioned before, leadership is implicitly understood by those who look up and see, or those who are above in the ranks and have subordinates in power. And so when we look to identify potentials in the general management pipeline, I think taking local leadership expectations into consideration is necessary, because otherwise we risk these individuals' peers and bosses and subordinates not seeing them as management material, and therefore essentially tripping them out of the gate. Still, we've faced many locations that say, well, we want to observe headquarters expectations of leadership strictly speaking, exactly how they define it. And especially if headquarters is from an established or a respectable market, that interest can be well magnified. What it boils down to is being fair from a local interest and perspective versus standardization across the business units. But I think if we have well thought out talent management strategies that call for the use of fair objective metrics while considering both those perspectives, and we have research available that helps us to inform where we can flex that model to ensure the same results will transpire at the end of the road, but we can give equal footing to cultures across the world, I think we can get the best of both worlds. Thank you very much for having me. I'll take any questions.